When we were watching the young Karl Marx, you may recall that at one point Proudhon gives his work to Marx and says, please read this and give me your comments. And I was sitting over here and I was like, big mistake, don't do that. Because Marx is a ruthless, ruthless critic. He won't even let a small thing go or slide by. And he needs to be. He's not doing it for any egotistical reason. He needs to be because he's trying to move the working class movement to a clearer scientific understanding of its goals and objectives. And this is what we also see in what is one of the important texts written by Marx called the Critique of the Gotha Program. It was written in 1875, and it's principally written against this guy, Ferdinand Lassalle. Now, an effort was being made to bring together the various communist and socialist groups in Germany that was going to be the founding of the Social Democratic Party of Germany. And Marx supported that. He felt that this was an important step forward. But he felt that Lassalle had stamped on it his own program. And he felt that there were some really major theoretical blunders that Lassalle made. And he felt it was very important to criticize them. So he wrote this, the Critique of the Gotha Program. So the program begins by saying labor is the source of all wealth and all culture. Wrong, says Karl Marx right there. Labor is not the only source of wealth in the world. In fact, the other source of wealth is nature. It is labor and nature, when they come together, that they create new products and so on and so forth. So labor and nature are the source of all wealth. Lassalle then talks about the fair and equal distribution of the products of labor. He says there should be the fair and equal distribution of the proceeds of labor. Moreover, he says the proceeds of labor belong undiminished with equal right to all members of society. Now, if you were to read that, you'd say that's pretty communistic sounding to me. But Marx says, no, sorry. In fact, you're making a bungle of the whole thing. And he doesn't support it. In fact, most of the critique of the Gotha program is precisely on these 3 points. The first is, what the hell is a fair distribution? What is an equal distribution? And what is this nonsense about undiminished equal rights going to the workers? He says this is all a complete muddle. Lassalle does not understand political economy. He says the first thing you have to recognize is that when communism will be established, it will emerge from capitalism. And therefore it will be stamped with some of the features of capitalism. That cannot but happen. He says what we have to deal with here is a communist society, not as it is developed on its own foundation, but on the contrary, just as it emerges from capitalist society, which is thus in every respect, economically, morally, and intellectually, still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society from whose womb it emerges. So if you want to talk about what the communists are going to do if they take power, you have to be practical. You have to understand that this is a society being born out of capitalism. And you have to keep that in mind. This stuff about fair and equal, what does this mean? The bourgeoisie maintains already that the distribution is fair. In what sense? The bourgeoisie says, look, I went into the market, you came into the market, of your own free will, nobody forced you. I offered you a contract, you looked at the contract of your own free will, and consensually, with your consent, you accepted that contract. Correct? Worker says, yes, correct. Political economy also replies, yes, correct. If you accepted it out of your complete consent, then in what sense is it unfair? You have your consent on it. For the bourgeoisie, therefore, including in gender politics, consent is the final line at which they say if something is consensual, it's fair. And in capitalism, it appears to be consensual in the sense that the worker accepts that particular contract. But he says this is a complete muddle, this is a complete confusion. Why? Because what appears to be consensual is in fact itself a historical product, the result of depriving the workers of the means of production. That is why the worker has no option but to seek within the capitalist an employer. And so for that reason, what is at stake is not whether something is consensual or contractual or fair, etc. But in fact, it is to question the entire foundation of political economy and to argue about what is fair and unfair not that just that we need a fair distribution, but the real question ought to be, what is that? Because given that the bourgeoisie says that it's already fair. What does equal distribution mean? Similarly, Marx says. Will everybody be paid equally? Of course not, that's absurd. If everybody is paid equally, Marx says, that will be unequal because everybody is contributing unequally. So you're doing 8 hours of work and you're doing 2 hours of work, and if I'm paying you equally, that's unequal. So that can't be the basis of it, right? So what does this mean, equality? अभी आगे चलते हैं, इसको जरा देखते हैं, ठीक है? Let's just stay here. And what is this undiminished nonsense? He says, it cannot be undiminished. Whatever the workers produce, part of that has to go into the general upkeep of society. For example, part of what the workers' labor is used for is to replace the means of production used up. So the machines that have been ruined, those have to be fixed, etc. That can't go undiminished. Secondly, there has to be an additional portion for the expansion of production. Investment has to be made. New things have to be created. That can't go undiminished to the workers. There has to be a reserve or insurance fund to provide against accidents, dislocations caused by natural calamities, and so on. That cannot go undiminished to the workers. There have to be costs of administration. That's not necessarily just labor, but other administration also has to be done. Politics, everything else, etc. Who's going to pay for that? That can't go. That has to be diminished. There has to be common satisfaction of needs such as schools, healthcare services, and so on. These have to be provided in a growing society, and that, therefore, the undiminished proceeds of labor cannot go to the working class. And there have to be funds for those who are unable to work. Again, that has to be taken out. That cannot go to the... So this whole idea of a fair, equal, undiminished, distribution of the proceeds of labor going to labor itself, this is a total bundle of what socialism is. This is obsolete verbal rubbish, he says. In fact, Marx is much harsher than that. Engels later then redacts and censors a lot of the phrases Marx writes. He says, okay, yeah, there was no need for that. We'll just get rid of all of that, etc. He says when socialist society is created, it first has to accord with what he calls bourgeois right, capitalist right. What the hell is this bourgeois right? The slogan from each according to his ability to each according to his need would only be implementable in a much higher stage of communism. Okay, that's much, much later is going to happen. In the immediate stage, after capitalism is overthrown, what is the principle you're going to use? It is the slogan from each according to his ability to each according to his work. In other words, however much you work, that is the amount you get paid. If you work 8 hours and you work 2 hours, you will get 4 times what he gets. That's the way that things have to be managed in the lower stage of communism. And this, he says, is a bourgeois right. To pay people according to the labor they've contributed is not the communist principle, but it is something we have to implement when we are in the lower stage of communism. He says the right of producers is not proportional to the labor they supply. It is not equal to the labor they supply. You will supply 8 hours of labor. Maybe 1 hour of that labor is going to be used for all of these things. Diminish hoga. It has to be, because other things have to be done that are not necessarily productive labor, but they are necessary for society. People have to be standing at traffic lights and say, go, come back, etc., all of those things. That's not productive labor, but it's necessary for society. So all of these things have to be done. Where does the food come from to have those people do that kind of work? It comes from the laborers who produce the food. They don't get the whole food they produce. Some part of it is reduced. It goes to other laborers who do other very, very important things. They teach in schools. They run hospitals for free. They do all sorts of other social services. They take care of sick people, etc., all of that stuff. There are people who may not be able to take care of themselves. Society takes care of them. All of this is also important work that has to be done. So you can't get the full proceeds. Sorry, can't happen. But you can get it in the proportion. So if we're deducting 1/8 from you, we can deduct 1/8 from you. Everybody gets deducted the same amount to run all those things. And also, of course, to increase production. That's also the most important thing, is to increase production. So some part of labor has to be used for that. And so somebody has to create the food for the laborers who are right now creating the means of production, which in turn will create the commodities that can be consumed, right? That has to be, somebody has to produce the food for that. They have to sustain the laborers for that activity. But it can be proportional. It can be proportional. So if you do 2 hours of work and you do 8 hours of work, you can get 7/8 of that, and you can get 7/8 of your 2 hours of work, and that can be just. So you get the same in the same proportion. Also, moreover, if you're doing skilled work and you're doing unskilled work, you're doing 8 hours of skilled work and you're doing 8 hours of unskilled work, and your skilled work is worth 4 times as unskilled work, then technically you are doing 8 into 4 times work. This is also bourgeois right. So in other words, under socialism, how will workers be paid? Under socialism, workers will be paid in accordance with the quality and quantity of labor that they produce, but this will be in the same proportion that all people will be paid. Some part of that labor will be used to pay the workers who do all the other things, including increasing the means of production, including administration, including all running schools and hospitals and social services and street lights and everything else that is necessary in society. That's how the political economy of socialism is organized. Socially necessary labor time can be used to estimate certain things about a commodity, etc. But a society does not have to organize the prices of commodities in accordance with socially necessary labor time individually, though it may have to organize it collectively. That it's a complex question, but the simpler answer is this, that in socialism, commodities don't have to cost the socially necessary labor time that it takes to produce them, because the government can fix the prices. So maybe it takes a high amount of SNLT to produce a PhD, but the government will give it to you for free. So the price is not in accordance with SNLT. It doesn't have to be. But if it's giving you one thing for free, that has to come out from something else. So that comes out from where? It comes out from maybe luxury items or something else. So if one thing is below the SNLT, another thing will have to be above the SNLT in order for everything to be balanced out. This will happen automatically. If I reduce this, automatically the burden falls on the other thing, which in relation becomes obviously more expensive than its SNLT average. So it happens automatically if you subsidize one thing. But for a socialist society, it's not necessary that products are placed along that line. The majority of products will be placed roughly along that line, but certain key products may be deliberately subsidized to grow the economy faster or to provide certain goods to society that are essentially important and so on. He says, look, these defects are inevitable in the first phase of communist society. Now he calls it the first phase of communist society. Later the Marxist movement starts to call the first phase of communist society socialism. And they begin to call the higher stage of communist society communism. So if you talk to a Marxist, he will say Soviet Union was building not communism, they say he was building socialism. And the critique of the Gotha Program, what it has said about how labor is going to be paid, becomes the central idea around which Soviet Union, People's Republic of China and others organize how they are going to pay the working class, how they are going to organize economic production, in other words. So these defects are inevitable in the first phase of communist society, as it is when it has just emerged after prolonged birth pangs from capitalist society. Right can never be higher than the economic structure of society and its cultural development conditioned thereby. The right that you give to people can never be higher than the level you have developed society in terms of the productive forces. You cannot move past bourgeois right, he is saying, until you have moved past those conditions of production, until you've created an economy which can produce so much that you don't care about bourgeois right anymore. Because everybody can have so much with doing just a few hours of labor a day. You may have, for example, 3D printers and artificial intelligence and robots, etc., doing all the work for you. Once that is the case, then you don't need to go for bourgeois right. But in the 19th, 20th century, and in third world countries like ours, you will have to go for bourgeois right, is what he's saying. And distribution, what is all this talk about distribution? Distribution is only a consequence of the conditions of production, he says. Now, several things just immediately come to us from here. You will hear so many people tell you communism is against human nature because in communism everybody gets paid the same amount. What rubbish. Obviously these people have not read the critique of the Gotha Program, because clearly Marx is saying that if we give everybody equal stuff, that's actually unequal, firstly. And if he says if we give everybody an equal standard, if we make labor the standard, and we give everybody in proportion to the labor that they get, that's just bourgeois right. That's still not communism as such. But it's necessary. It's important to do that. And moreover, it's not going to be the case that everything you produce you get. No. Because some of the stuff you produce, we are going to need to do all of these important things as well. So bourgeois is then Lassalle says, all other classes are only one reactionary mass. Marx says, what the hell are you talking about? I have never said that. And in fact, we don't believe that at all. What we have written in the Communist Manifesto is that the bourgeoisie is a revolutionary class, firstly, especially in relation to feudalism. They do not form together with the bourgeoisie only one reactionary mass. This is nonsense. The feudal class and the bourgeoisie are two very different things. Feudal class is very reactionary compared to the bourgeoisie. We will even support the bourgeoisie in relation to the feudal class. They are not one and the same for us. They are not all the same for us. No. Moreover, he says the lower middle class is becoming revolutionary. How? In view of its impending transfer to the proletariat. Even the middle class, the lower middle class, looks at what's happening with capitalist production and says, no, we need a revolution. So are we going to say they are also reactionary? Of course not. Are we going to say the artisans are reactionary? The small manufacturers are reactionary? The peasants are reactionary? What a load of rubbish. And then he says, your internationalism has completely disappeared. This is the phrase he uses. He says, you didn't talk at all about the international brotherhood of working classes in the joint struggle against the ruling classes and their government. That's very, very important. Okay, workers have to work together from several countries to bring about the end of capitalism. That you cannot forget. Then he says, Lassalle talks about the free state. We are going to have a free state. And he talks about the abolition of the wage system. And together with that, he says, wage system bhi khatam kar denge, or iron law wages bhi khatam kar denge. Or all social and political inequality will be finished. He says, Marx will have none of this utopian nonsense, he says. What is this phrase? If I abolish wage labor, says Marx, then naturally I abolish its laws also, whether they are of iron or sponge, doesn't matter. Secondly, and more importantly, if you mean by the iron law of wages what Thomas Malthus means by the iron law of wages, well, that theory governs not only the system of wage labor, but every social system. So just because you eliminate wage labor doesn't mean you eliminate Malthusian paradox, if that's what you mean. Of course, Marx thinks Malthus is talking nonsense, right? But he's saying you are talking even greater nonsense because you're just confused about this whole thing about the iron law of wages. If you're saying you're getting rid of the wage system, just say that. Why get into this whole debate about the iron law of wages? And what the hell is a free state, for God's sake, says Marx? How can you be so utopian? There is no free state. Either you have the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie, and don't fool yourself with this democracy and representation and elections and so on. Okay, it's the rule of the bourgeoisie. The rule of the bourgeoisie is the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Or you can have the rule of the working class, which is the dictatorship of the proletariat. There's no free state. There's no pure absolute democracy and all this stuff. And between capitalist and communist society, there lies the period of the revolutionary transformation of one into the other. In other words, a transition. Corresponding to this is also a political transition period in which the state can be nothing but the revolutionary dictatorship of the proletariat. Transition, this is what will happen. So, finally, the real task is not to argue that slavery must be abolished, because the feeding of slaves in the system of slavery cannot exceed a certain low minimum. No. Once you have accepted that the wage system is basically a system of slavery, then that must be destroyed precisely because it is that. Slavery, exactly. This whole reading is essentially just illustrating that last sentence. That if once you have recognized that wage labor is a system of slavery, then the task is not to better the condition of the slave within that system. No. The task is really to break the system of slavery. That's the first task. And that goes for patriarchy, that goes for slavery proper, like blacks in slavery in the American South, and that goes for colonialism, he says, that goes for one nation exploiting another nation, he says, that goes for one gender or sex exploiting another gender sex, and that goes for the capitalists exploiting workers. Once you've acknowledged it is slavery, what becomes imperative for you then is to break the chains of slavery. That's what communists have to do. Thank you.